So I'm just going to dive in just for sake of time. So just really quickly, as just a brief bit of background, some of you all have already heard this story. So the idea for empathic intelligence is actually not new or authentic to IDEOS. It was adopted from the work of Dr. Rosalind Arnold, who is a PhD out of the University of Tasmania, and who authored a book, kind of the tome on empathic intelligence, especially and specifically written in the context of teaching and learning. So how can teachers become more empathic? Because what has been found is that when you do so, it helps your students learn better. I read that book and thought, oh my gosh, this is what I've been talking about when it comes to empathy. I haven't been talking about this kind of more soft skill that most of us know empathy by. It's really this much more strategic kind of intelligence, a way of engaging with a diverse, challenging, and complex world. And so that's really kind of the start of our work 5 years ago. And we thought we were going to be able to spend lots of time thinking really deeply about what empathic intelligence is and how it's applied in more social contexts. And then, as I like to say, America happened, and we were all of a sudden being drawn into much more practical applications. So how does empathy, in particular empathic intelligence, play a role in our current state of political polarization, social polarization, and even more recently, democracy promotion, which has been a very interesting space to think about. Does empathy even have a role or something to say in those places? And we think it does. So I want to just, rather than using slides and things like that, I'm just going to kind of talk to you about what empathic intelligence is, what the framework looks like, how we're thinking about it in terms of social cultural contexts. And then really what I'd love to do is just field your questions, because I think that's a much more interesting conversation and workshop, which is, how does this apply in your context? So I'll start with just the framework. So most research has shown that there are 3 types of empathy. So you have cognitive empathy, you have what is often referred to as relational empathy or affective empathy, and then there's the final, some people call it compassion, some people call it motor empathy, but it's the more active aspect of empathy. What we recognize is that those 3 types of empathy don't sit separate from one another. They actually kind of feed upon one another and create this kind of circular process that is akin to lifelong learning. So how do you grow in your intelligence? By constantly thinking through and being actively engaged in building your empathy on each of these levels. So I'll start with cognitive. So cognitive is what we would kind of say, and we call empathic intelligence broadly, but even more specifically, the cognitive version or aspect of empathy, which is a way of knowing. And so it's, how do you know what you think you know? And one of the great ways of building your cognitive empathy is just learning about everything that you don't know, which often means engaging with other people, other stories, other perspectives, other experiences, to develop more data and intelligence around how people experience the things that you think you know about or care deeply about. So for example, if you are a person who is thinking deeply about the issue of race, or race is kind of a contextual issue for you, you can do lots of things. If you are not proximate to lots of diversity, cognitive empathy can actually be formed by reading books, by doing research on different experiences, different stories, trying to understand that perspective through the lens and experiences of somebody outside of yourself. And so you actually don't have to be in proximity to people to do that. Although it is better when you can do it in an interrelational way, an in-person way, but that's not always possible. And so what we often do is we introduce things that either expand or challenge the way in which you see or experience the issue that you are trying to build your empathic intelligence around. So what does it mean to be them? And how has their perspective been formed and informed by their own story and their own experience? And so you actually, through that, get to consume new data that largely gets implanted in the subconscious mind, and is great because it gets pulled out at the most inopportune times. which often is when you are in highly stressed or important situations where all of a sudden your brain gets to draw lots of new challenging data that might say, oh, those people aren't quite that bad, or they're not quite that different, or they're not quite fill in the blank, depending on what your context and your own experience and perspective has said about those people. So that is basically cognitive empathy. It is the knowing part and the kind of the brain part of building your empathic intelligence. But you cannot stop there, because just having a cognitive understanding about people's own lived experience, their perspectives, is actually insufficient. And so what we've recognized is that there is a relational part that is critical to building your empathic intelligence. And so it usually requires being in proximity with people that are different than you. It is an intentional process where you are kind of putting yourself in situations where you are around and immersing yourself in relationship with people different from you. It is probably in our times one of the greatest challenges that we have, because we've all learned to self-select into, and our society makes it very easy to self-select into environments where we feel very much affirmed in our own sameness. Whether that is, let's move to the suburbs because we are all very comfortable with being away from the urban problems, or we just like being in our religious communities where we all think and believe alike, or even we like being in our ethnic communities where we feel safe, affirmed, and seen. Now, none of those are essentially bad reasons to self-select out of diversity. But when that becomes the primary way in which you engage with the world, in which you see your own identity mirrored in others, it becomes very self-affirming, and you can very much end up having and consuming the kind of data that only comes to you through media, the kinds of negative stories that are often told about the other, so that your brain has very limited data to see the humanity in others, especially those that are different than you. And so that relational piece is really core. How can I actually relate to and be in relationship with others, especially those that are different from me? And then the final piece is ultimately getting to the point where what we would call, someone call compassion. So kind of this compassionate care and concern for others. But we actually kind of take it a step further, because really what the kind of motor empathy is how do you make decisions? And how do you make decisions that are both kind of supportive of yourself, but also supportive of others, and not seeing those as mutually exclusive? And so too often we see that as being binary or in opposition to each other. And so my rights, my beliefs, my worldview, of course, must be right. And therefore, anybody who thinks differently than me, therefore must be wrong. And so when I make my decisions, it is in that binary context, because all I know is that the others are a threat to me. And I'll actually talk in, I always feel like, well, if you come later today, you're going to actually hear this all over again with a little bit more science behind it. But when you get to a point in society where 3/4 of the country feels like if somebody holds a different perspective than they do on an issue they care deeply about, and they themselves feel either fully or somewhat threatened by someone holding that position, we are actually in real trouble. And that is actually where we are today. 74% of our country feels like if somebody else holds a position that is in opposition to theirs on something they feel deeply about, or that is very core to kind of their own beliefs, they feel threatened. That is one, just scores very low on the empathic intelligence scale. But in addition, it creates an environment where pluralism cannot exist. People cannot be in community with one another where we feel like we cannot express differences of opinion without feeling personally threatened as a result of that. Now, I say that with a caveat. It doesn't mean that being empathically intelligent or having empathy for somebody else is acceptance, approval, or agreement. I can completely disagree with you and still have tremendous empathy, because somehow I understand your why, and maybe perhaps can see that there is a humanity or even a reflection of my own experience somewhere in there. And so it lowers, what I always say is empathy is great. It's not the total solution, but it can lower the temperature so that real action can happen to try to reduce the animus that often exists between two sides of an issue or a society that sees things very differently. And so I generally kind of just use that as a framework and a starting ground for a discussion on empathic intelligence, because you can see why that might have application to education and learning. When I can understand that students might interpret the information that I'm sharing differently based on their own experience, their own background, the stories that they've been told, and the stories they tell themselves and others about how they see themselves. And so what you think is a great lesson in history or sociology or political science or anthropology might make total sense for you, but somebody else may be receiving it in a way that actually is unaffirming, might actually be received as wrong. And for them, in this day and age, often feels very threatening. There is no learning once that happens, because interestingly enough, our brain takes over and creates a defensive shield that basically says, there's no reason for me to listen to this. And so in education, coming to a point where you actually are empathically intelligent in your presentation of material is critical, especially in a context and in a kind of point in our own society where a lot of this is happening and being shaped and formed in the academy. So students are coming into the academy and are experiencing lots of different information and context and the pressure of what's happening in the world. And they're sitting there saying, I just want you to see me. I want you to understand that I may not have the same perspective and worldview as you. Doesn't mean that you're wrong, but it doesn't mean that you're right. And I think that is a really beautiful part about this work of empathic intelligence, is that there is a great humility in this work, which says, I actually don't know everything there is to know about X, whatever name your issue. I feel like it's every issue. Like no issue now is not a polarizing topic. But the really interesting thing about doing this work is to have so many people ask me, Christy, why is it that you don't get more angry? Or they assume I actually don't hold a strong position on anything. And I'm always like, ask my husband. He knows. Ask my kids. They know I have very strong positions. I have very, strong beliefs about something. But I also know I only know this much about the issue at hand. And it's been such a gift to go around the world and experience different populations and cultures and experiences and stories. And for me to ask the question, how do you see this? Which has only enhanced my understanding of the issue. And tonight I'll actually do an exercise that kind of shows practically what empathic intelligence looks like when you have a group of people who are all trying to participate in that practice. And so I'll kind of leave it there. Again, I don't want to take up all of the time by me droning on about this. I would love to hear how you guys are receiving this. Maybe some of the areas where you're really finding it challenging, both to either be empathically intelligent yourself, or where you think it's really those people who aren't, you doing it. I have tons of empathy. I score super high on the empathic intelligence scale. It's those people who actually don't have it. And I'll maybe add one last thing. There are a lot of people say, well, how do you measure empathic intelligence? And it's an area we actually are working on right now, is to develop an empathic intelligence kind of scoring assessment system. Because the interesting thing is that right now there are lots of empathy. You can go to a lot of different places to kind of figure out where you score on empathy. The challenge is all of those are self-reporting. So it's, how am I on X? What happens when I do X? When I'm confronted with this, how do I respond? Very rarely are we honest. And so what you find is most empathy tests, the scores skew really high when it's self-reporting. And so what we're trying to figure out is, can we use things like artificial intelligence and different types of technologies where instead of you just talking about how empathic you are, you actually get confronted with different scenarios where you have to make a choice. And the choice you make sends you in a different direction and also accumulates data that then AI can learn from. So we're trying to figure out, how can we actually use AI for good on something like how do we develop an empathic intelligence framework, but also getting constant feedback and data from users that help us understand it better. So it's still definitely a work in progress. So I will stop there. Happy to drone on about lots of this stuff because it's super wonky, lots of neuroscience behind it, but would love to hear if you have any questions either here or online.
So I'll come as the online, but can I start with a question?
Yeah.
So the orientation towards us as faculty members, teachers, to sort of model like empathic intelligence, right? And so I think part of an answer to my question is that modeling. But another question is how do we kind of encourage empathic intelligence, in a classroom, especially we have faculty members who are trying to do deeper like deliberation, right, on difficult topics where it's, there's often resistance, right, to engaging with those topics because they're disturbing, they're uncomfortable. And so what are some ideas that you might have to help us help our students, sort of lean into that empathic intelligence?
So I think that first, starting with the assumption that the ways in which we tend to teach, especially topical information, is a little bit different when you're thinking about something and not totally like math, right? So that sometimes, not always, doesn't have a social context. I put an asterisk because sometimes it can, but where 1 + 1 = 2, largely we don't debate that, right? So there's not a social context. But recognizing that in most other areas of teaching and most other subject matters, it's assumed and taught often from a dominant perspective. Doesn't mean that the dominant perspective is wrong, but it makes assumptions about how that information has either been accumulated, how it gets transferred. And so I love often environments that really are based in much more of a Socratic method. So it's much more about asking more questions than you think you have answers to, I think is a powerful tool for learning. And they're finding this, especially at younger ages, where if you can start young people off by learning how to ask more questions than they have responses to, how much better critical thinkers they are, they become better learners. And there's almost an automatic intellectual humility that's kind of baked into their own kind of as their own formation. So I think one, that is a huge tool in learning is how do you inspire curiosity? I think I'm not a teacher, but I grew up with one. So I'm just I often channel her she was both my 5th grade teacher and then eventually became a professor. And so I often think about sitting in her classes and learning from her and just understanding kind of the context in which she spent most of her professional life. And I think so often the challenge with and I say the academy very broadly, but just elites in general, is that the point, and we talked about this a little earlier, is that somehow truth is also certainty. And so as a professor, or even as a teacher, a leader, especially in our culture, being right somehow has become the dominant, a dominant part of our culture. And we often feel like in those roles, our goal is to basically share this truth with whoever it is that we have influence over. And what I find really fascinating is when you go to other cultures and find that their youth are so much more advanced educationally than our folks are. And a lot of it is because they start with this Socratic kind of method really young, which is, I actually am in a leadership position or in a teaching position. I'm not necessarily here to tell you what truth is. I'm actually here both to share what I think I know, but also being open to being challenged by those folks and being curious about, well, how would you think about this? How might this apply to you? Being really interested and curious about how the information might land on a diverse student body or just your student body in general. And so I think there's greater learning, and we know that there's greater learning outcomes when there's more of a Socratic method, when there's greater curiosity that's modeled on behalf of both the professor, teacher, leader. It inspires and I think frees your students up to then ask questions both of you, but also of themselves, to be much more curious, just citizens in life, versus assuming that, well, I sat in 4 or 5 or some of us 8 years of education. And oh, by the way, the only thing that got modeled to me was I've had a bunch of professors for whom certainty was the point. And so therefore, I'm assuming that that is how I should engage with the world, right? That is the model and the culture under which I learned. And it's often then what I bring out into the world. I think certainty has become, sadly, one of the most misunderstood, but largely tragically trafficked as a tool of power and authority and influence. And I think we've gotten it really wrong as a result. Yes.
To kind of further elaborate on that previous question, I guess I'm wondering, how does power dynamics in academia play a role in it? Because even if there is a level of empathic intelligence among students and among professors, there's still this really big disparity. And I think, like you mentioned, certainty and feeling like we need to be certain or we can't challenge or because of this big power dynamic. And so how do you, I don't know, what do you think about that? Or do you have any solutions for that in a classroom setting?
I think a lot about power dynamics. I often ask this question in the work that I do is, what do you do with power? And I'm not sure, and again, I always say empathy has its limits. I'm not saying that empathy is, or even empathic intelligence is the end all to be all for finding solid solutions, but I do think it's a necessary starting point. If you don't have, we were just talking about it, and I've shared this in a couple of the conversations I've had so far, is I've often said to my kids, and I say it a lot in the work that I do, you can be right or you can be effective. Doesn't mean they're not always in tension with each other. You can be right and you can be effective, but just because you're right doesn't mean you're going to be effective. And so we actually have been engaging our work much more in systems change, which is addressing power. And I often first start with, systems are nothing but people. There is no system out there that we are trying to change. We are trying to influence people who have the power to create systems. And so if you can get really good at influencing people, you actually can influence power. And so one of the things I share, we're doing a training with a big national poverty organization with their leadership who are trying to move into more national advocacy. And one of the things I share with them in their kind of step one is, what do the people that you're trying to influence, what is their day-to-day life like? What are their constraints? What are their goals? But ultimately, what are their needs? Because if you can, and we actually have an entire empathy mapping framework, an exercise that we have folks do, very much taken from the tech industry. It's why, most of you who have any computer science knowledge or knowledge of the tech industry, why we walk around with this glued to our hands. I always said the most effective thing to influence your children was to threaten to take this away from them. And there's a reason why. The tech industry empathy mapped all of us and figured out what is it that they need and what is it that they will find incredible, attachment to. And they figured it out, right? They got it right. So I'm like, if it worked for the tech industry, it should actually work for us. And so we've taken it and taken their empathy mapping and done it and translated it into a cultural, social context. And so I often ask participants who are going through this, have you actually empathy mapped the people in power? Because people in power actually have levers, right? They have needs, and they have wants, they have desires, and they have day-to-day lived experiences that are often outside of those who are trying to advocate for change, right? We have usually 2 very different lived experiences, and we have 2 different life objectives. But what often happens is when you can empathy map them and build your own empathy for them, you become much more effective at engaging them. Now, you may not be able to move them. I always say the one thing about policy and legislation is it moves very much like a giant ship, right? An ocean tanker in the ocean that moves little bit by little bit by little bit. And I think what happens is too often we think that our goal for social change is to move it 180 degrees, right? We're going to take this giant ship that has been going forward in the ocean, and somehow we're going to get that sucker to turn all the way around. And so if we don't do that, we think we have failed. And I say, well, first of all, sometimes you don't want it to go 180, right? Because there's some stuff that you actually want to keep in there. And until you actually understand that ecosystem, you don't sometimes know what's worth keeping. Doesn't mean that it's always worth keeping, but that process has actually helps you identify that. But when you think about, and I often try to just kind of bolster and support those who are trying to be on the front lines of change. Like if you can change 5 degrees where something is, 2 generations from now, they are that vote is in a completely different country, right? Because what might look like nothing to you has actually taken that vote in this completely different direction. But in one of the greatest levers you have is figuring, how do I move the people in power, even incrementally, which means I've got to understand what it is, what are those levers, and what are their objectives and goals, so that I can maybe connect the future I'm trying to create with their objectives and goals. But so often we just see empathy as only being deserving of us, like, right, you should have empathy for me. But I guarantee you, if you can start thinking about what is it that their lived experience is like, what might shape and inform why they vote, think, behave, right, like they do, I might actually find that somewhere in their story, there's a way of connecting with them and connecting my objective with something in their objective and humanizing power. I think we don't do that enough. We don't humanize power. And we assume that just because somebody maybe has a different perspective than us, maybe they are trying to take us in a very different and sometimes hurtful, harmful direction, that somehow they're evil people as a result, or they are worth becoming the enemy. And again, you can be right, but that's largely not effective. Most social change movements that have actually worked have happened because the leadership of that social change movement figured that out, how to have empathy, and I would imagine empathy mapping, even though I'm sure they didn't call it that, but figuring out what is it that will humanize me to them. I've often said that when you look at big social change movements that have been successful, if you take, for example, the LGBTQ plus movement and how that in a very short period of time went from being something that was on the margins to much more acceptable. Does anybody have an idea of why that happened?
I think for me, it's just the fact that homophobia and transphobia, but transphobia to a lesser extent, but queerphobia in general doesn't have a material basis. So changing it doesn't really change economic. Say, for example, upending racism or misogyny would require huge economic changes that would greatly, so people who are drawing material power would have to lose that. But if you're sort of removing homophobia, assimilating queer people into straight culture, I don't necessarily see that as removing homophobia. You're not at any material loss. And yeah, I worry that we drift too much into ideological change when we talk about this, but it really is just the fact that it doesn't support the interests of capital.
Yeah, that could definitely be one for sure. Any other ideas?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, my name's Tom. That's a great example, and I'll tell you personally, real quick, I was raised in a family that, you know, gays were just some weirdos and craziness. And when I was in college, we took a trip to Disney World and stayed with some friends, and they were gay. They were friends of friends. And I got to know them. I thought, you know what? My parents are wrong. And what it took was, I guess, maybe your second example of actually meeting somebody and just listening to them. And it completely, well, in that case, I changed 180 degrees in 1 week.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think it was things like that that changed that. I think that's a great example. I think that ship's maybe not 180 degrees, but it's completely different from when I grew up, you know, in the 1950s. So anyway.
Yep. No, that's an excellent point, and you're almost dead on. It was actually Hollywood. Oh, sorry.
Storytelling.
Yes.
Love is love.
Yes, it was Hollywood who took the gay, lesbian, queer experience and normalized it as part of families, normalized it as part of normal stories, it included them as, as members of just regular society, where people said, oh, wait, they do the same things we do. Oh my gosh, they actually have the same kinds of family issues. Their kids are just as bad as our kids, right? Like, it normalized a part of the population who people largely had not been in community or proximity to. So kind of going back to empathic intelligence, it was new stories, which became new data. So all of a sudden the brain said, ooh, those people aren't quite so threatening. They're not quite so scary. They're not quite so different. And that levered upon, obviously, decades of activism and movements and all of that, layered upon what really became just the humanization of a part of the population that many people thought of as foreign, different, strange, right? You could just go down the list. All of a sudden was like, oh, they're just like us. And doing that over and over and over and over again is now new data for the brain, that when I now meet, and I'm literally being overly dramatic, but when I meet a gay man in the dark walking down the street, and my mind has to quickly think about, ooh, is that enemy? Is that someone I should be afraid of? It has lots of great data to pull from and go, nope, they're actually okay. We're good, keep going. Whereas data from before, right? Before Hollywood made that shift, before it was kind of just a normal part of who your neighbor is, who's the parents of your kids' friends, all of a sudden they were so foreign that if I saw them out in the public, immediately my brain went, oh, all I know about them is this. And so therefore they're too different, they're too foreign. And you enemize, you immediately otherize those folks, and it's very easy from that point to dehumanize them. So it's really, we owe a lot to Hollywood. They get a lot wrong. Trust me, they get a lot wrong. But in this situation, they became a huge ally and asset to that social movement.
Thank you, Christy. So, I think that absolutely the gay marriage movement was able to utilize storytelling, marketing slogans, love is love, and like in concert with Hollywood to normalize gays. At the same time, so my question is going to connect back some of what we talked about, empathy in the classroom, it's about like the cost of empathy and power dynamics. So, and like what type of social change we're talking about, because for a lot of queer people, the gay marriage movement, what the part that was most easily assimilated, like the parts of queerness or homosexuality that were most easily assimilated and normalized, were also departures from some of the most radical eruptions and disturbances of like that seeded some of the resistance and defense of, people who were like, what is marriage? Why is it so normal like that? Feminist critiques of marriage. Maybe we should have radically different, more seriously democratic and egalitarian social structures and stuff like that. So for some people, like gay marriage is very much about normalization, and that is also like more. But so that relates a little bit to like my fundamental question that I'm getting to slowly about the cost of empathy. So I really like empathy is one word that I'm using more recently, and the way you're talking about it is helping me use it in different ways. I do have an embrace empathy sticker on my laptop because I see how it's also a cornerstone of feminist pedagogy in the classroom. And empathy in the classroom, from what I hear from students, is not universally easy for instructors. Right. But I have found it to be very effective. And a part of that is listening to the students' stories, right? Like really understanding them, putting myself in their place. And I have found this a very effective pedagogy. And I also see that it's pretty easy when I'm the professor, because there is that power dynamic that Dessa was talking about. And so it doesn't cost me a lot. Yeah. Given that it doesn't cost that much, it's surprising that more of us faculty are not using it, because it really is not, doesn't cost that much. Yeah. But then when we think about the different and unequal costs of empathy, like when we're at a predominantly white institution, like, yes, we seek out spaces of comfort, which is a good time with the India Field art gallery show. Some of us were at that event Tuesday. So students who come from groups that have been historically excluded from the university, you know, the cost of empathy is higher for them.
Yeah.
You know, finding a safe haven in the midst of a predominantly white culture and institution and heterosexual predominantly, even though 30% of our students are LGBTQ+, and that those Gen Z changes continue to transform some of the experience. But I guess I'm always wondering, like, what type of personal calculation, because I really use empathy a lot and I'm aware of the privilege that I have to do so.
Yeah.
And honestly, what you were saying is kind of my job description, influencing power.
Yeah.
But I wonder about students in particular, as well as employees belonging to groups historically excluded from the university, from, you know, the same way you're like for the vast majority of its existence, making that sort of calculation, because sometimes, and we've said before, like it's about survival, you know, and just like what is that personal, individual, or collective calculation like, you know, and how do you have any insight on the different cost of empathy in different social contexts and different like dominant groups, et cetera?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I'm gonna back up to answer your question fully. So I can't remember if we talked about this in our discussion earlier at lunch, but a couple of weeks ago, I was in Washington, DC at a conference, and we had an icebreaker time, kind of cocktail time, where just to introduce different participants to each other. And so we had to go through these icebreaker games. And then one of them was, after you give your answer, you talk about why you're here and what you do. And so as soon as like I even said the word empathy, someone at the table says, "Oh, that's incredible that you do that work. But there's also a moral question to empathy, which is, who is deserving of your empathy?" And immediately I'm like, he doesn't understand empathy. Because empathy is not something you give away, right? It's not like I have a limited reserve of empathy, and every time I have to make a calculation of, ooh, if I give them some empathy, then therefore I'm gonna have less myself. And so again, going back to even the third aspect of empathic intelligence, which is recognizing that you can actually live on behalf, make decisions on behalf of self and others, and see them as not mutually exclusive. And so I'm often asked, and so I'll give more of an anecdotal story answer. I'm often asked, why are you not angrier at the injustices that exist in the world? Especially as somebody who has confronted and immersed themselves in injustices and conflicts and all of that for a good, like the second half of my life. And I say, it's not that I am not upset or not angry at those injustices. It's not even that I don't lament a lot of what exists in the world. And it's not even like I don't have my moments, right, where I just like lose it and like, empathy be damned, right? Like, I just need, but I always go back to, Christy, do you want to be right, or do you want to be effective? And for me, empathy is a tool to be effective. And so it's not emotional. It's not emotional exchange. I don't have to make an emotional decision as to whether or not I choose to be empathic when I'm faced with somebody who might actually desire for my existence to not be, for me not to be here anymore, or for someone who wants to deny me my rights. Because I realize in that moment, this isn't a debate. Like, I'm not entering into this because my goal is to change your mind. My goal is to figure out, how can I be more effective in maybe being one person who moves you 5 degrees, one way or the other. So for you to enter into my experience and hear my story and perspective, which means to do that, generally, I have to be open to their story and experience. And hopefully, hope that they will invite me into theirs and share so that I can share my story. And so kind of that empathic intelligence piece recognizes that my only goal in life is to be able to share my experience and hope that in that transference and the humanization of myself to somebody else, I'm moving them 5, 10, and, God forbid, 15 degrees away from their own position, so that maybe eventually that power actually ends up over here. And maybe being able to make a decision that actually is on my behalf. And so is it the totality? No, but I find that doing this work is such a strong foundation. And it does, I'm not gonna say take the emotion out of it completely, because I'm somebody who often said for many times, I'm so tired of being everybody's Black experience, right? Like, I'm so tired of being everybody's woman experience, or whatever that is. But I realized that that's where my power lies, is sharing that story to somebody who has no idea what it's like to be me. How else are they going to know what it's like to be me if I don't share the story? But I've just learned to be really effective with how I share my story. So I don't know if that answers the question. I guess what I would say is, does this have its limits? I think it depends on what your goal is for it. If your goal is to shape and change and move somebody who is in a position of power to make a different decision, then that's probably not the right application of this work. This application of the work is to create an environment where you soften so that you can hopefully try to be more effective in your engagement that you have with those levers of power, so that you can hopefully move them, degrees. And then hopefully that opens up a space for the next person to come along and they're a little bit more open, and then they move even more degrees. Yeah, so that's probably the best I got in the power space.
Go to someone online. So I think I see Michelle has a hand up. So Michelle, please share.
Hi, Dr. Vines. Thank you so much for letting some of us in from outside of the college to come in and learn from you. I'm at UNC Charlotte, and I prepare people to teach middle and high school mathematics specifically, but in general. And I'm sure you may agree that some of the most empathic people are teachers, and that's part why they get into this work. They love children. One question I have for you is, one of the things we're experiencing, I love your 3 types of empathy. And in respect to the last one, compassion, and having that active compassion for students comes along sometimes with compassion fatigue. And yes, especially with teaching today, with the onslaught of, just the attacks on teachers, they're fatigued in a lot of ways, but also with the kids today, there's a lot going on. And so how do you have some advice, techniques, or whatever that I can share with my teaching candidates or even teachers in the field about how to combat the compassion fatigue? And thank you.
Yeah. And let me thank you for the question. Let me first say, on behalf and out of respect for all the PhDs and doctors in the room, considering I did not do that dissertation, I am not a doctor. So I I just want to say that. And also just because, I was raised with a woman who did achieve the PhD and required us to call her doctor. So when she finally achieved it. So I just want to put that out there. But it's a great question. I think people who are generally tend to be more empathic, it's a burden, right? Empathy does have, its own implications, and fatigue is one of them. And that is more of kind of a scoring on kind of the empathy scale, just in terms of personal empathy, and how you perceive the world. You tend to take on more emotional weight than others would do naturally. I'm not sure, I'm not a psychologist, and I know that there are some really, really great and really smart people who are thinking about this and have dedicated their life to thinking about this. But I know for myself, what I've really tried to do is to understand that my empathy, my true empathy for people who often are like me, who I like, who I love, right, who I care for, which sadly, I shouldn't say sadly, is becoming more and more parts of the world because I engage with so many parts of the world. And so I feel like I carry the weight of lots of different parts of our population, both domestic and global. But I think what I've realized is that, and actually I'm going to use a story that very much informed me by a Catholic sister who was also a therapist. and she lived in a largely poor urban environment where many of the people that she would work with had incredible and immense trauma. And she was interviewed on PBS, and they asked her, how do you do this work without just like completely breaking down, right? After decades of doing this work with people who are coming with incredibly hard stories and experiences and circumstances, how do you just not burn out? And she says, I learned that I could only control what I could control. And she said, so what I've learned to do is that when somebody comes and sits in front of me and shares their story and their burdens, I open my hand and I allow them to place their burden in my hand. And for the hour we're together, I carry that burden for them. And I share with them what I can do, or I come alongside them and do what I can to help them. But I recognize that I have limits to what I can do. And so when they get up to leave, I hand it back to them. And I thought it was such a beautiful way, kind of a beautiful story, an illustration of what it's like to do this work with real deep empathy, which is recognizing that we are not able to change somebody's life. We're not able to change the world. I've been in conflict environments where I literally got on a plane, and as I was coming home, I knew that in my heart, there was a real strong chance that some of the people that I engaged with may actually not be there when I came back the next time. And that's a real weight, right? How can I leave somebody who I'm deeply connected to and not feel the weight of that for the entire time where I'm no longer with them in their country? And I can't do anything to change the outcome. And I realized that, you know what, in that moment that I sat with them and maybe allowed them to unburden themselves a little bit, that was enough. Like that was all I could do. And I think that has largely informed how I do this work, because I come in contact with people who are carrying incredible burdens and are advocating and trying to create change, not necessarily on behalf of just those other people who are experiencing the problem, but often because it's also their own burden. It's their own pain. It's their own trauma. And so in those moments, I've just realized, you know what, I have a role to play, but that role is limited. And so I try to emulate the sister by taking on their burden and maybe walking with them with that burden for as long as we're together. But I very much have learned to give that back to them. And I've actually practiced it a lot with my own children. And that has been a huge gift, recognizing that as all of us that are parents know, it's a hard world out there and getting harder. And I can't make it better for them every day, but I can very much be present when they need me to be present. Is that helpful?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
I have one more quick question, in 2 minutes, so Jamie.
I don't know.
Yeah, well. Go ahead.
This might put on the limit.
And I can stay a little longer after. Yes, please.
I'm curious, like, what advice you have for how to empathetically approach conversations, dialogue with people on an opposing viewpoint that that viewpoint threatens empathy. So as an example, next week is Fan Book Week. We were just talking about Hollywood being a catalyst for change, for giving people empathy.
Yes.
Right? I mean, opening that door.
Yeah.
And so if you're engaging with a dialogue about someone who is saying, I don't want people reading certain books, that in itself works against empathy. So how do you like, it's like meta, right? In terms of like,
Yeah,
I don't know.
No,
like I said, I don't think it's a short question.
No, but it's a good question. It's one I get a lot. Is because most of the time it's easy to engage in dialogue or have empathy for somebody who agrees with you, right? The hard part is what happens when there's somebody on the other side of the issue, and especially something I care deeply about, right? And so what I say is that as you kind of situated empathy in that, I might say that I think it's actually our own as a collective misunderstanding and misapplication of empathy. I don't think we understand empathy well. And a lot of that, and again, I shared this a little bit earlier, so if you heard this, second time you've heard this, no diss to Brene Brown, but kind of people like Brene Brown, I think have created an emotional context around empathy that I think in most cases is actually unhelpful. And I love Brene Brown, like literally. I was sharing earlier, I actually spoke at her alma mater, and like that was the hardest thing for me to say. Was like, I know you guys, I love Brene, and like she's a product of this institution, but I think she's harmed empathy and others like her by making it something that we emotionally have for somebody else. Because actually, and I'm sure this earlier, emotion is kryptonite to empathy. We emotionally empathize with people like us, just naturally. And so when we emotionally don't like somebody, or emotionally that is like negative, it actually limits our ability to empathize with them. And so that's why we've moved, and our work is not in empathy. Our work is in empathic intelligence, because what I would say is the work, oftentimes the great or the powerful point of this work is first having to identify what's my objective in this. Is my objective to be this person's best buddy? Is my objective to completely change their mind? Or is my objective to help implant a new data point so that they have something else to consider? And I often say it is a gift to actually have somebody be open to your story, because that is power. You now get to implant a different data point that they may never have experienced in their day-to-day life. And if you see that as, my goal is not to change your mind. My goal is actually to share some of myself with you so that you can actually see me as more human. And maybe then you'll be a little bit more open to the next person who comes along and shares their story. And now you're even a little bit more open. And so I see it as this process of like tag team. Like I'm handing the baton off to somebody else, and I did my work by just sharing my story. But my goal is not to convince somebody that they're wrong. That is not the point of empathy. Actually, the point of empathy, and especially empathic intelligence, is growing in my own intelligence and awareness. I think, for example, so I'll just give you a quick, brief example. You know, as someone who identifies as a Black woman, you know, my assumption was growing up, especially through college, was that of course I can represent the Black experience. I'm a Black woman, except for the fact that on my maternal grandparent side, my grandmother was first generation Irish. My grandfather was first generation West African. Very unique immigrant experience on my mother's side. My father's side, my father was from deep South Alabama, Sylacauga, Alabama. He had blonde afro and hazel green eyes. Why? Well, because there was a slave raped by a slave master. So I had a very unique perspective and experience and stories and all of that, but it wasn't at all like some of my cousins who actually were raised in the Deep South and had a very different experience from me as a kid who was raised in LA, right? But there were lots more people who might have looked like me. I was probably accepted and embraced more. I was around lots of diversity. And then I had all this diversity in my family. And there was this awareness that, oh, wow, I actually, even as a woman of color, I don't understand the full Black experience. I couldn't. I have a very unique story and perspective and experience. Is it a part of that story, the broader narrative? Absolutely. But I don't understand it. I can't speak to it all. And so it was recognizing that, you know what? I actually don't have the full story of even some of the community I identify with. I don't know what it's like, for example, to be a white woman in New York, any more than I know what it's like to be, you know, a Cuban American living in Florida. Both women, right? We each have a piece of the story of what it is to be a woman, but we certainly don't have the totality of that story. And so what empathic intelligence has become for me is a way of saying, I want to understand all of these issues and areas more so than I can certainly understand it, because I only have my own lens and perspective and experience. So my job is to even go to the people who I might not like, I might disagree with, but to say, you know what, I want to learn what it's like to be, because that adds new data for how I understand the fullness of this issue. And I oftentimes will throw away 80% of that. But that 20% is valuable new information that helps me become a better citizen. And it helps me grow in my own intelligence. And so I see it much more as a tool that inspires and improves my own self. It's not something I'm giving away to somebody else. And so we can completely disagree. You can actually not like me. You can actually not even desire me to exist. But that wasn't my purpose was to make you see me as a human being. It was to be available and present, to share my story in a way where hopefully that catalyzes some change in you. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.